Morgan Moshe. Okay. Today's shir is sponsored the Schus for Shalem Rafal Chaim Shar Yashiv from Baba Chaya Rivka. Okay. Now I want to talk about. We're going to start We'll take us a few weeks to get through it. I want to talk about Bezdin, when Bezdin doesn't exist anymore, what the powers of Bezdin are still, and other such examples. But let's start like this. We know that Bezdin today, the Sanhedrin, was Nisvatel at the end of the Bayis Sheni, and it doesn't have the power anymore to put people to death, to inflict capital punishment. So let's start with you know what? Let me start like this. One of the most say common occurrences where you'll see the power of Yidden to put someone to death, even mamash up to the modern era, even something that's very, very recent, where you'll see that being done, even though the din of a Sanhedrin, the power of a Sanhedrin is weakened, is by a Meiser. When someone informs on other Jews, or is a habitual informer who are afraid he's going to continue informing on other Jews, so you'll find that he could be put to death or injured or etc., even in today's day and age. Now just to frame this, I'll read you a quote that was written by a Russian government official, a Russian general, in 1838, a general by the name of Dmitry Gabrilovich Bibkev. If I'm saying his name anything remotely correct, he wrote a brief to the government of Tsar Nikolai I, and he said as follows. He says, there's a terrible thing that goes on, that Jews get killed for, informing on other Jews who are committing crimes. He says, this is his quote, it's even more heinous, that the Jews do this, that they kill other Jews, because it is committed in places intended for prayer and for studying and the principles of faith. A lot of these murders, a lot of these punishments are meted out in a synagogue, in a shul, a place that's really committed for Torah and Avodah. Such actions is in the nature of the autonomous adjudication by the court of Jewish rabbis, carried out on the basis of their false law concerning the elimination of informers who reveal their co-religionist crimes. This is they're able to make these ad hoc batei dinim in their shuls, and they can put to death people who inform on other Jews. The greater the crime, the more tricks the Jews devise to conceal the guilty parties and the real reasons that brought it about. Despite all efforts at intensive investigation, they succeeded in obfuscating the inquiry to such an extent that not only does the identity of the guilty party remain unknown for a long time, but even the identity of the murdered person remains unknown for a long time. So this is a Russian government official in 1838 who's writing about trying to stamp out this terrible evil of killing Meisrim that exists in the Jewish world. A different thing I came across once, Reb Reuven Margolius, in his Sefer on Sanhedrin, Margolius Hayam and Daf Mem Vav, he brings, and the reason why this is interesting to me is because he's a person who died in 1970, and he's bringing a personal story that his father told him. He's telling a story from his own town in Galicia, where his father told him a personal story. He says that there was a meister in his town. It's called Greiding, right near Lvov in Galicia, and there was a meister over there, a tough guy, and Azpanim. Nobody was able to stop him. He says, Pamachas Belel Yom Kippurim Lifnei Amiris Kol Nidrei. When there was on Erev Yom Kippur, Lifnei Amiris Kol Nidrei, Kasha Amad Oisei Meiser. When that Meiser stood, Atuf Betalise, wrapped in his talis, B'Kaisel HaMizrach Samach L'Makam HaRav. He was sitting in a very prominent place on the Mizrach Vant, right near the Rav, getting ready for Yom Kippur. He says who the Rav is, Harav Damasas Agoni Vishua Klugerzal, Nagshu Anashim Achadim El HaMeiser. A few individuals came up behind the Meiser, B'Talisei, Shehishpil Ad Lamata Me'ein of Sasmu Piv. They pulled his talis down over his face, they tied up his mouth in a way that he couldn't talk and couldn't scream. And they took him out of the shul which stood on the banks of the river. They threw him into the river. When his body bobbed back up to the surface on Yom Kippur day, Kyle went out, a news bulletin went out that he drowned himself. And on Motzei Yom Kippur they buried him. When the police found out, they started doing investigations, and he says, they dug at his body to see what the cause of death was. And then they started collecting witness statements from everyone who was in shul on that day. Harav, Shchenav, everyone who stood near him on the front on the thing. And he says, the biggest nest that ever happened in our town is that in a shul, that had 400 mispalim on Yom Kippur, no one breathed the word. He says that's the biggest ness. And this went unpunished. And this is a story, maybe late 1800s, early 1900s, hard to say exactly, but basically running till very recently. So that's and everyone in their mind, I think, knows like folklore, stories, different things of like Meisim who were put to death, right? This is a pretty common, shtetl justice, I think, includes putting Meisim to death. It's a pretty common, shtetl justice piece. So let's go through some of the chazals, the gemaras, the halachas that lead up to this framework in halacha that allows this to be done. So originally we have to know that Bezdin, the Sanhedrin Agdeilu that sat in Lishkas Hagazes, they were the ones who were able to enforce the dinim of capital punishment that the Torah gives to many, many different averos, right? There are many different averos, chamuras, that the Torah prescribes the Einish of Misa for. And the Bezdin Agadol sitting in Lishkas Hagazes, in the Beis HaMikdash, they were the ones who were able to do this, to met out this Einish to people who needed it. Now, towards the end of the Bayis Sheni, so it says as follows, the Gemara of Avodah Zarah and Daf Ches says, Mem Shana Ad Shleicharav HaBayis, 40 years before the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Galsa Sanhedrin V'yashva La B'Chanus. Sanhedrin was Galsa from its place and it sat in Chanus. So the Gemara says, Lamai Hilcha. So what's the nafkamina if Bezdin went into Galus and they were sitting somewhere else? He says the nafkamina is, Amr Vitzlik V'Ravdimi, Leimer Shaleidanu Dine Knasis. To tell you that they were no longer able to down the dinim of Knasis. The din of giving someone a knas, which is, an extra punishment, an extra penalty, that wouldn't be, justified by the regular laws of Chesed Mishpat, they weren't able to do that anymore. Says the Gemara, Knasis? What do you mean? Knasis is telling in Smicha. Knasis has nothing to do with Bezdin sitting in B'mkaimai. And the Gemara brings a famous story with Yehuda ben Bava and how he salvaged Smicha for Klal Yisrael for a few generations. So Knasis still went on. So says the Gemara, what was it for? Ela Amar of Nachum Bar Yitzchak, Lo Yitei Medina Knasis. Don't say that the power that they lost, that they ceded when they left the Lishkas Hagazes was Knasis. Ela Shaleidanu Dina Nefashis. They stopped donning the dinim of Dina Nefashis. Anything that had to do with capital punishment, they stopped donning those dinim. My taima. So says the Gemara, what's the reason why they left and they stopped dining the din of capital punishment? My taima. Given the chazu de nefishi lehu roitzchim, they saw there was a lot of murderers. There was a lot of there was a lot of material for capital cases. And they weren't able to down so many of these cases. It's better we should be running from galus to galus, so we shouldn't be bechayev people to be killed. Bezdin understood this din, that being in the Lishkas Hagazes is what imbues them with their power. And if they're not sitting in the Lishkas Hagazes, they lose a certain amount of their power, and they're not able to do any more din in nefashis. So because of that, they ran away, so they shouldn't have to down any din in nefashis. Now the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and Daf Lamed Aleph says this in a more, call it like a spiritual sense. The Gemara brings a Maimon Chazal that says that when the Shechina left Yerushalayim by Bayis Rishon, the Shechina left in 10 phases. Like first it left from the Kruvim, then it left from the Aron, then it left from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, then it left from the Beis HaMikdash. It receded further and further. Kilu Kaviyachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu was saying, I don't want to be here with you, and I'm moving further and further away from you. And then the Gemara makes a parallel, and the Gemara says, in Keneged, the Yud Masayis that the Shechina went when it left Eretz Yisrael during the Bayis Rishon, so too the Sanhedrin left during the Bayis Sheni. It was Galsa 10 steps from where it started in Lishkas Hagazes, and as it diminished in its power. So there seems to be some sort of like a ruchnistic component, that the Sanhedrin, when the Sanhedrin was moving away from Eretz Yisrael, it was reminiscent, or lying in it is the same, closeness of the Shechina that was being, degraded, that was moving away further and further away. Now, so once the Sanhedrin left the Lishkas Hagazes, it's mashma from the Gemara and Avodah Zarah, and this is a din pashit. That Sanhedrin that isn't based out of Lishkas Hagazes, isn't based out of their seat of power in the Beis HaMikdash, no longer has the ability to give it, to dan din nefashis, to give einshim that involve, capital punishment. The Rambam in Yad paskins like that, and the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos in the beginning of Chulin, in the end of Parak Aleph and Chulin, the Rambam brings an interesting hoysafet to that din from the Goinim. The Rambam says as follows, he says, Vida, he says, Shemeseiris biyadenu. We have a Meseirah now. At the time that this Pirush Mishnayos was published and learned for the first times, the Shuvas Hagayim were not available, and nobody knew where this Meseirah is. Today, a lot of the fragments of Shuvas Hagayim have been found, and we know that it's a Shuvah from Rav Netroy Gain and other Gainim. There's Gainim who say what the Rambam is saying over here. And the Rambam says, V'dash, Shemeseiris biyadenu. We have a Meseirah, which we know comes from the Gainim. Merabisenu b'Kabbalah, Dvarim Rabim me Rabim. Rabbi from Rabbi. Shezmanenu zeh. Our time, Zman HaGalos, She'em Baydin Nefashis. This Tkufa, where we don't have the power to dan din nefashis, ein ze ela b'Yisrael shavar averis misa. this is only talking about Jews who committed one of the sins, one of the averis that the Torah says, you get an einish misa about. Aval haminim v'atztukim v'baisusim kifi roiv rusan. People who are uprooting the faith, tztukim, minim, baisusim, etc., who are, danger to Klal Yisrael, to Yiddishkeit. Kifi roiv rusim, ein shenoisam shalei yafsidu es Yisrael. There's some sort of dispensation that even though we don't have the right to normally kill, Bezdin lost its power to kill when it's not in Lishkas HaGazis, but people who are causing, fomenting problems in Klal Yisrael, them you're allowed to kill anyhow. And this has been paskin like this, says the Ram, halacha l'maisa, anoshim harbe ba'artzis ha'mayriv. V'gam kein, he says, ha'makobel b'yadeinu v'maforsim lasses al-piv, she'esha oisa averu shechayev lav Mrs. Bezdin, someone who actually does one of the averis that Yechayev Mrs. Bezdin, and there we know we don't kill him, hoyel ve'einonu yechalun ladin hayom din nefashis, so hayom machrimin oisei chayrim oilum. They put him in a life sentence of chayrim. They would say you're in chayrim forever, and that's it. And this is with Sefer Torah, and then they would give him Malchus Mardis, and the ve'ein matirin oisei oilum, and you never take him out of this chayrim. So the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos gives us less like his own halacha that he's deducing from the Gemara, and more the Messiah of the Gaonim. Like what was done in Klal Yisrael, what was the Messiah of Psak? He says the Messiah of Psak was that people who were uprooting Klal Yisrael, who were causing, problem to the Messiah of Klal Yisrael, them, they can be put to death even Bizman Hazeh. But people who can't be, so then we put them in Chayrim and that's all. Now, there is seemingly, along the way of where we stand, where you won't hear of anybody being put to death for anything, there is like an exception. The Rosh...
In Williamsburg, they don't do it. The Ram means of the Bezdin when he says that this one.
So these are all we'll get. This is the Grace of Machlekes Rishonim. What it means when you say these extra legal killings. We'll get that in a second. But there is a one like exception to this rule, and that is the Rush in his Chuvas in Klal Yud Zayin. A few times he talks about like that we would consider very strange by our standards today. Cutting off a nose, cutting off a tongue, cutting off an arm. The Rosh has some very interesting Einshim, which maybe we'll revisit at a different point. But when it comes to capital punishment, when the Rosh talks about killing people outside of the Bezdin structure, the Rosh says as follows. The Rosh's shaila that he's being asked is what we would consider pretty mundane. The Rosh is being asked is a person who got into a fight, the entire fight with his neighbors, and he was Mechayar from Megadef. He said, Shem Hashem with curse words. So they hauled him in, and they said we should put him to death. The din in the Torah is that someone who says Shem Hashem with a curse gets put to death. And the Rosh has a whole tshuva back and forth, and then he brings as follows. Here's the shaila takes a long time to unravel, and then the Rosh says as follows. He says, this that you're asking me, dina nefashis, l'shalenim dina nefashis, ki b'chol ha'aratzis sheshamati aleim, all the lands that I know their halachas, that I participated in their halachic legal systems, ain't done in dina nefashis. We don't do dina nefashis anymore. Lulei poi be'eretz Svarad. Over here, where I came late in life, in Eretz Svarad, I see over here, you guys seem to be able to dan dina nefashis. V'temani ma'oid b'boyi haloim. I found it very, very strange when I came here that you were allowed to dan dina nefashis. Eicha you danim dina nefashis b'lei Sanhedrin. How could you dan dina nefashis without a Sanhedrin at all? The Amruli ki hormona demalku. When I posed this question, they told me we have a special dispensation from the king that we're allowed to do this. V'gam ha'eder shevtim lahatzel. And we follow the prescriptions of the Torah. We try to save. We do the best we can. And he says, and this is, I think, the line that makes this exception make sense. Says the Russian, what they explain to him is as follows. He says, Think about how much more blood would be spilled if we would just let the legal system of medieval Spain be followed, and Jews would be subject to the regular legal system, justice system of medieval Spain. Many, many more Jews would be killed for many, many more minor infractions. He says, see, there seems to be in here a certain like a kernel of Hatzalah, afilu. Like what the Rosh is describing in Spain is, yes, they have the right to kill, even though normally without a Sanhedrin there's no right to kill. But it seems to be almost preventative. Like if we don't kill the people that al pidin we have to kill, then the Spanish authorities will just say, okay, these Jews have no way to run their own business, and we'll start killing everybody that they think is appropriate. That'll be much, much worse, he says. So, and the Rosh says, I allowed you people to do your minig. My stempel you never got. I don't get, even though the Rosh has many chuvas where the Anshim we would consider very strange. The Rosh says, my haskama to capital punishment you never got. I'm not holding by stopping you, but making an issue about it. But this is the thing. So along the way to Kilu totally eradicating capital punishment, there is, like in Spain, it seems, in the during the Tkufas Rishonim, there was a certain amount of capital punishment that was still being enforced, but it almost seems like it was to save people from being subject to the regular din of capital punishment that was going on in the day. Now, this that we're talking about makes it to Shulchan Aruch, obviously, and the Ramah and Siman Tav Chav Ches, the Ramah Paskins, that Agiret we can't kill anymore. There's no Sanhedrin, we can't kill anymore. And the Ramah takes it even a step further. He says, Kol chayve misas bezdin bizman hazeh. Anybody who would really be chayve in a misas bezdin bizman hazeh, ein biyadeinu lahalkoisei or lahagloisei or lahargoi. And this again comes from the same Chuvas HaGainim that the Rambam is talking about, where they hold that the einish of someone who does something that deserves to be killed, did a very, very severe chamerdik aveira. It says there's no makam to give him a small einish like Malchus and call it a day, or give him a small knas and call it a day. We don't have anything to substitute what he deserves. Yeah, we can't kill, so that's off the table, so you can't do that. But we can't substitute it with any of these other einshim, chavtai to beat him. So what does he say? Just like the Gainim say, we put him in chayrim, mavdilan isim in a kahal. Almost like we don't want you to be part of our tzibur because you're a bad influence, so we separate him from our kahal, mavdilan isim in a kahal. V'cholza mitzad adin. Now here's a very important detail, and this is again similar to the Rambam. V'cholza mitzad adin. This is all min adin. Avlim royim bezdin, shut tzarech shah. If Bezdin sees that there's a special tzarech hasha, migdar milsa, and there's something that needs cleaning up, then they could give einshim in any way they see fit, just like I delineated in Siman Beis. V'dafka b'din nefashis, hitzrichan Bezdin, aval haniragim b'lei Bezdin. Fine, okay. So this is the din that the Ramah paskins, which sums up what we're saying from the Gemara, is that when Sanhedrin left Eretz Yisrael and Lishkas Hagazes, it lost its ability to give out din and nefashis anymore. But there still is some sort of opening where someone who is either a danger to the tzibur or is a roidif or one of these things, there could still be an opening where there's potential to still hand out capital punishment. So now let's move on to that sugya of where the exceptions come from. So the exceptions come from, and I want to start, just give a little bit of background. The history of Klal Yisrael during the Bayis Sheni, the kings, after the story with the Chashmonaim. The story with the Chashmonaim happens during the Bayis Sheni, when the Greeks take over Eretz Yisrael, and they mess up Klal Yisrael pretty badly. They corrupt Klal Yisrael pretty badly, and then over time, the Chashmonaim come back, and it's a small resurgence, a renaissance that leads to like the beginning of Klal Yisrael again. But it never becomes what we would have in our mind, the renaissance of Klal Yisrael going back to Tefarta and being mamash a huge tzibur of Shemitah mitzvahs and everything being straightened out. It doesn't happen like that. That's not how the end of Bayis Sheni goes down. It ends up becoming very, very irreligious kings, slowly till the end, until the Jewish kings themselves invite the Romans in, and that leads to the destruction of Beis HaMikdash. It never really gets that big lift, back up. So during this tkufa, very, very soon, actually, after the Chashmonaim, I printed a chart because it's hard to keep track of this. But Matisyahu, we know, had 5 sons, right? Of Matisyahu's 5 sons, not all of them became kings. Yehuda was killed in battle. Eliezer was killed in battle. Yochanan, Yonasan, and Shimon are the ones who become kings. Now, Shimon is the one who reigns for the longest, and his son Yochanan Horkanus is a king, and then Yochanan Horkanus' son, L'chayra, who is probably the most famous Chashmonai king, is Yanai HaMelech. Yanai HaMelech is a famous king for that kufa, is Yanai. Now there's grada machlekes in Chazal, the Gemara in Brachas, on the Chates and Aleph brings the machlekes Abaye and Rava, if Yanai and Yochanan are the same person. Abaye says, who Yanai, who Yochanan? Yochanan is Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Yochanan is Yochanan who went off the derech. Yochanan started off being very frum for 80 years, and then he goes off the derech and becomes a tztuki. The Gemara, Abaye says, Yanai hu Yochanan, it's the same person. Yochanan, who was once such a tzaddik, became so bad, he went down in history as Yanai HaMelech, the terrible Yanai HaMelech that we know. Rava says, no, Yanai l'chud v'Yochanan l'chud. Yanai was Yochanan's son. Yanai was one person, Yochanan was another person. But be it as it may, whether Yanai was 2 people or Yanai was 1 person, let's wrap him up into one just for the sake of this conversation and explain the tkufa that was going on and where these extra legal punishments come in. So Yanai was very insecure. Alexander Yanai, let's assume like Rava's Mahalach, which seems to be the Mahalach that most of the Chazals go with, that he was Yochanan's son, was the younger brother. He was someone who was not going to be king. And when his older brother became king, Yanai was put away in a castle somewhere to languish. He wasn't going to become king. And I think it's normal that if you get sentenced, banished to a castle somewhere, when you finally have your time in the sun and you become king, a certain amount of insecurity, I think, is to be expected. So Yana came out and he was very, very insecure. He marries his brother's Almana, who was the heir to the throne at that time, and he takes over the throne. Right away, as he goes in, no. They weren't. Yeah. And he comes in, and he right away starts killing out the Prushim, the Talmidei Chachamim, because they were a big threat to his legitimacy, to his standing. He right away starts killing out all the Talmidei Chachamim in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael. And there's different Gemaras that say different amounts. The Mashal, the Gemara in Kedushin on the Samach Vav says that Yanai was on his way back from a conquest, and he sat down to a feast, and he was eating, and the court jester told him, "You're eating a Suda like Shlomo Melech," and etc. And then he says, someone pipes in, Yehuda ben Tabai, I think, pipes in and says, Kaiva Malacha Prushim. The Prushim are out to get you. The Talmidei Chachamim, they're not, they're stirring the pot. He says, how do you know? And it's a whole, till Tzimseif, the story ends that he's ready to kill all of them. And the Elam asks, if you kill all the Prushim, all the Talmidei Chachamim, what's going to be the Torah? He says, Torah te munachas b'karen zavius. The Torah could sit in the corner where it sits, and call me sheyirtzi yava v'yikr. Anyone who wants can come and learn from the Torah. So the Gemara comments, miyad nizrika by minus. A certain amount of apikarsis fell into him, because Torah shebachsav, that's fine. But Torah shebapem atei. If you kill the Talmidei Chachamim, no one's going to teach you the Torah. And the Torah needs interpretation. So, but he killed all the Prushim. And the only one he didn't kill was Shimon ben Shetach. The Gemara, for example, the Braisa in Masechtas Tainis tells us that when Yanai was in the Beis HaMikdash, he did things wrong, shalei kahalacha, and the Olam threw their esrogim at him. We have a Gemara in Sukkah that says Regmu esrogim. The Gemara in Sukkah doesn't tell us who it is. The Braisa in Masechtas Tainis tells us it was Yanai HaMelech, who did something, that was shalei kahalacha, and they threw their esrogim at him. And again, the repercussions are obvious. He kills thousands of Prushim. At the time of his deathbed, when laying on his deathbed, the Braisa tells us that Yanai took captive 7,000 Talmidei Chachamim, and he put them in a prison, and he instructed the guard, upon my death, kill all these people. And he said, why? Because I know the Prushim are going to be happy when I die. It'll be a mixed bag for them. They won't know if they should be happy that I died, or should they be sad that 7,000 Talmidei Chachamim died. So Yanai was in a cage match, a death match, with the Prushim. Now Yanai had a brother-in-law, Shimon ben Shetach, who was from the earliest Tanoim, and Shimon ben Shetach was spared. Yanai's wife, Shimon ben Shetach's sister, saved Shimon ben Shetach, and she sent him away into hiding. Now the Gemara in Brachas tells us that Shimon ben Shetach, there was a time that in Yanai's court, they were trying to figure out what Birchas Hamazon to make, and they didn't know what Birchas Hamazon to make, and they realized that this has gone too far, and there's no Talmidei Chacham, they don't know anything about halacha, and she bartered for her brother's life, and she said, I'll bring him back, but you have to promise me that he's safe. And they brought Shimon ben Shetach back, and there starts a certain small revival renaissance starts happening in the court of Yanai Melech, where a little bit halacha starts coming back into play. Now, the Braisa in Masechtas Tainis tells us that Shimon ben Shetach was placed on a Bezdin Hagadol Yerushalayim of 71 with 70 other Amaratzim, because they were all Psukim. Everyone else there didn't know any halacha, they knew Psukim. So Shimon ben Shetach devised a shtickle ingenious way to weed out the Bezdin. He knew that if he would stand up and say that tomorrow Bezdin has to be all my friends, it would have no shot of being listened to. So what he said as follows: it makes sense, you guys at Stukim, and everything that's important to you is Minhag Torah Sheb'Ksav, what's written in the Torah. He says, so every din that we paskin in Sanhedrin, Aleinu lahavi raya from a pasuk. So you have to bring a raya from a pasuk. Now, this is not a din that applies to a regular Jewish Bezdin. This was Shimon ben Shetach's innovation for the Tztuki Bezdin. And then one by one, he would, as the most esteemed member of the Bezdin, he would task different dayanim with writing the paper of the psak, for today's psak. And he would say, today it should be your turn. And that guy who was an Amaritz would struggle, wouldn't come up with a pasuk, and Shimon ben Shetach would say, it seems you're not suitable for the Bezdin anymore, okay, so you retire, and he would take one of his Talmidim. Until slowly, after enough time, he stacked the whole Bezdin with Talmidim and Shimon ben Shetach, and he weeded out all the Tzukim, and the Braisa in Masechtas Tainis says, I forgot which day it was completed. On the day that it was completed, that Shimon ben Shetach restocked the whole Sanhedrin with proper dayanim, is the day that we're not allowed to fast. It's a happy day. It's a Yom Tov in Klal Yisrael. And I say this just to give a little background to the Tkufa that Shimon ben Shetach was living in. Now, with this in mind, the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Mem Dalet, I think, tells us a few procedural elements of how a Sanhedrin has to operate when it's dealing with capital cases. The Gemara says they can't down two things in one day, They can't, there's a few different procedural elements. And right away the Gemara starts asking, the Gemara seems to know that there's a story with Shimon ben Shetach where he didn't follow these procedural elements of how Sanhedrin, when it dons, Din Nefashis is supposed to be done. And the Gemara keeps asking a few points. The Gemara jumps up and says, Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach didn't do that. So what's this story? And 1 second. And to which the Gemara finally retorts, after like a few back and forths, the Gemara finally answers. The Gemara says, Amr Rabbi Eliezer Shamati. Rabbi Eliezer says, I heard that the Pshat in Shimon ben Shetach, and the takeaway din that we could take from Shimon ben Shetach, Shamati, he says, Shebezdin makin va'inshin shalem and atayra. Bezdin's allowed to do things that are out of the lines. And he says, not lamed al divrei Torah, not to punish someone for violating a specific halach in the Torah, ella lemigdar, he says, I'll read it for you. He says, Tanya Elazar ben Yaakov, Eimer Shamati shebezdin makin va'inshin shalem and atayra, v'loy laver al divrei Torah, ela kedei lasa syag la Torah. To create boundaries, to create some sort of deterrent for the Torah. It says, there was a story, there was someone who rode on a horse on Shabbos, during the Greek Tkufa, which is this Tkufa that we're discussing, the Shimon ben Shetach Tkufa. They gave him skila. It's only a derabanan to ride on a horse on Shabbos. It's not a deraisa, you don't get skila for that. He says, Shuv ma'aseh ba'adam echad, they gave Malchus. So the Gemara brings a raya to each one. Makin va'ainshin. Ainshin refers to the ultimate einish, being put to death, and makin just means beating. And the Gemara brings a story of each from the Greek period that Bezdin, although they seemingly don't have the power and they lost their power, they're still allowed to do things that you wouldn't expect that they're allowed to do. So now what is the story with Shimon ben Shetach? So the story with Shimon ben Shetach, Rashi brings, the Bavli doesn't tell us. The Yerushalmi elsewhere says the story, and Rashi brings a slightly different version than the Yerushalmi. Rashi and Sanhedrin brings a slightly different version of the Yerushalmi. It brings as follows. There was a story, Rashi says, of a terrible guy in Russia who died on a day, and a pretty decent guy, a Rebbe who died on the same day, and their levias, their funerals were going out at the same time, each one heading to their own location, and at that time the town was attacked by an army or whatever, and in the confusion, the two mitas got switched, and the good guy went to the crypt of evil, Mr. Evil, and the bad guy went to the Chalkas Rabbanim, and the Talmud of this person was very bothered, and he would go all the time to his Rebbe's grave, and he would daven, he would cry. He was very troubled that his Rebbe was buried in the wrong spot, in the Rishonim place. And finally, after enough tefillah and davening, his Rebbe comes to him. His Rebbe tells him, "Relax, don't worry. I have it good over here. I'll show you what my schar is going to be. I'm going to be just fine. I'm going to be rewarded for everything. But I one time, did something small that I did something wrong, and I needed to be punished. So I have to be here for a certain amount of time to be punished, but ultimately everything's going to be good for me." So the Talmud asks him, and so until when is your sentence? When are you finally going to be able to move on and not be punished? He says, until Shimon ben Shetach comes and takes my place. When Shimon ben Shetach, the great Satana, comes and takes my place and gets punished instead of me, then I'll be able to move on. So Shimon ben Shetach, why is he going to go to Gehenna? So he says, because there's women machashefes, there are ladies who are practitioners of kishif who operate in Ashkelon, and he doesn't deem to do anything about it. He does nothing about it, Shimon ben Shetach. So he's on the hook for all that they're doing. So this guy goes running to Shimon ben Shetach and he tells him, the whole story. This is what happened, and you might want to take care of this. So it says Shimon ben Shetach gathers up 80 Talmidim, 80 of his Talmidim, and they take young, strong men, and they take barrels, and they go on a rainy day, and all this is to diminish the power of these machashefes, and Shimon ben Shetach pretends to be someone else, and he says he's coming with a question, he needs to ask them a kishiv question, and they let him in, and his Talmidim sneak in and form a perimeter around them, and then each one, when they're all in position, he gives the sign, and every Talmid grabs one of them, lifts them off the ground, places them in a barrel, which seems to stunt their ability to do kishif, and brings them to Bezdin, and Shimon ben Shetach passes collective judgment on all 80 of these machashefes, puts them to death on one day, and hangs them, even though they're women, which is, again, procedurally incorrect, and remedies Klal Yisrael of this great evil. Now, this is the story of Shimon ben Shetach that's being referred to, that the Gemara keeps asking from, that V'aloshim ben Shetach, and from where the Gemara deduces that Vaistes is a din of Makan V'oichin Shalem Din. Vaistes is a way to go out of the lines and to do things that aren't regular. Now, the story rather has a sad footnote, is that Shimon ben Shetach, the reason why Rashi brings down the story is because Shimon ben Shetach's son, who was a good guy, Adam came to Bezdin and said that he committed something that he deserves to be put to death for, and they endured all the drishas and chakiris, and they kept it straight together, and Shimon ben Shetach's son was being taken out to be put to death. And Shimon ben Shetach's son knew that this whole thing was a frame-up to get back at his father for putting all these machashefas to death. And he made an announcement that when I'm going out, if I have this oven in me that they're accusing me of, loy tehemi sasi kapara. My death should not be a kapara. If I don't have this aver that they're telling me, then tehemi sasi kapara liyu l'chol Yisrael. And sadly, there was no way to stop this, and Shimon ben Shetach's son was put to death as like revenge for what Shimon ben Shetach did. It was that type of error. So, b'cholefen, the story is that Shimon ben Shetach was acting, very, very wildly out of the lines of what was allowed. And from there, the Gemara says Shamati, or Lazar Yaakov says Shamati. I heard there's a din that Makan V'oichin Shalem a din that there's ability to act outside the lines. Not everything is so straightforward like the din Amar. Now, okay, I'm running out of time here, and this din that Makan V'oichin Shalem a din is taka paskin like this in Choshen Mishpat and Siman Beis, and later on in Siman Taf Chaf Hey, with Shulchan Aruch paskins that even up to Bizman Hazeh, that there's a din that Bezdin's yachol to be Makan V'oichin Shalem a din. Now, like I started off with, the most common case where that could be found is by Maestrum. Now, I want to talk about a story with Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, who was arrested, which unfortunately was not uncommon for Rebbes in Russia, but his was a unique story, but it's going to be next week's story, and we'll talk about Maestrum in Europe and relatively recent history.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.